Most youth ministry podcasts are made by youth leaders and used to share their ideas on how to engage with the next generation of youth ministry.
Here at the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church, we're going straight to young people themselves to find out what they want from the church.
Like the prophets of the Bible, it is our hope that the voices of our young people will help inspire the church to better adapt to serve the now generation.
This is Mountain Sky Prophets.
Hey listeners, it's Courtney here, and I just wanted to give you a heads up that in this episode, we cover the topic of school shootings. If this is a sensitive subject for you, we understand. Feel free to skip this episode, or go ahead and tune in at the 18-minute and 42-second mark where our conversation begins to shift to different topics. Thanks for listening.
I'm Courtney Von Lindern. I am the designer of Next Gen and Inclusiveness Ministries for the Mountain Sky Conference.
And hi, I'm Amanda Daniel. I'm the coordinator for Young People's Ministry and Camping Ministry for the Mountain Sky Conference.
And today on Mountain Sky Prophets, we are interviewing my friend and partner in crime, Khasidy, from many youth events and camp events in the past. So Khasidy, do you want to take an opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, hi, my name is Khasidy. My pronouns are she and her. I'm 17 and I'm going to be a senior this year, and I live over in Montana. Some of my hobbies kind of include competitive Irish dancing, kind of out there, softball. I'm president of a lot of school clubs, hiking, floating, really just enjoying what Montana has to offer.
Wow, and where do you compete in Irish dancing?
Yeah, all over the Northwest, yeah.
Wow.
It's pretty cool.
I didn't know that that was a thing.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So, Khasidy, we've invited you on here today to just kind of share a little bit, obviously, about yourself, which we've done, and we've enjoyed getting to know you more, and hope our listeners have also gotten a chance to know you a little bit better as well. But we're also here just to kind of get your take on, what does church look like for you? What does spirituality look like for you? And those are big questions that we'll kind of start asking on a little bit more narrowed level. And you mentioned you're going into your senior year of high school. So I imagine you're probably starting to think a little bit about your future and what comes after high school. And I don't know about you, but when I was a senior in high school, the question I hated getting the most was, what do you plan to do now? What happens next? And so I'm just curious for you and kind of your generation, what does thinking about your future look like? And especially right now in a time of pandemic, how has that affected how you're thinking about, your next steps after high school?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of preparing you can do to go to colleges, and things like the Common App, and writing essays, and a lot of things that can prepare you to get scholarships to get into certain colleges. But there's also a lot of uncertainty about the future, because Gen Z and millennials, they've taken such a large step away from what we believe the norm is. You grow up, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, you retire, you die. That's the normal life that everyone has grown up to think that's what life is. But Gen Z and millennials have just taken such a large step away from that ideology. And this has not only allowed for more societal issues to become prevalent in the media, but also for a lot of things to change. A lot of things are being brought into context: climate change, societal pressures, disparity between generations, government relations, school shootings. All of these things were not very prevalent back, 20, 30 years ago, but now they are constantly in the media. We talk about it at school. You see it walking on the streets. You see people talking about these kinds of things. And it's kind of forcing the younger generations and the young peoples to have to learn about what these things are and have to learn how to tackle them before you go out into the real world. Just because there's so much uncertainty about the future of the United States and the future of the world and the future of the connections between different countries. All of these things have not really been as focused on before as they have. And Gen Z has kind of been forced to realize that this is our thing that we have to tackle, and this is not something that the older generations are going to help us with. This is something that we are going to have to figure out on our own, also while getting an education and starting a family, which is very stressful if you couldn't imagine. But the idea of having to now go to college and obtain an education while also being extremely worried about the future of our planet, and the future of our country, it's really hard to be uncertain about what the future can be. And as much as I want to say I know what I want to do with my life, and I know what I want to do in the church and I want to do in Montana, I just don't know what to say, because there's just so much that is surrounding everything. And yeah.
It sounds like there's a lot
Yeah.
to kind of tackle and be carrying and holding. And I know as you were talking, I was just trying to think back to, when I was a senior in high school and the things that I was most worried about. And
I was thinking that too.
right?
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, Amanda, you and I both are in the millennial generation. But thinking about when I was a senior in high school, and even like my access to media looked so much different than it does today. I know social media still existed. Like I was using Facebook at least, and I think Instagram was a thing, but it wasn't quite as huge for information sharing, and it wasn't something that I remember my friends and I going to be able to share a lot of like the sources and the info and the knowledge that's going around that we see today. I think part of that is like we lacked like the story feature of Instagram. I don't think that was a thing when I was your age, Cassidy. But yeah, and so I've been thinking a lot about like the things that I was worried about, and I feel like mine was just like, oh, like where am I going to go to college, or how am I going to pay for this? I wasn't thinking as hugely or as broadly about world happenings. And I'm curious, Amanda, just to kind of like throw in another perspective, like what was that like for you?
Right. I don't remember at all being worried about a lot of worldly events. I remember, yeah, being worried about where am I going to go to school? How far am I going to be away from home? Those sort of things. And when I started my freshman year of college, Facebook was just becoming a thing. So it was only between colleges. You couldn't necessarily be friends with everybody like it is now. So social media wasn't that big of a thing. It was becoming a big thing. But, I remember even doing classwork, and none of these big topics ever really plagued my mind. I can't imagine, what it's like to have that on my mind and worry about it in addition to all the other stuff. But we are definitely becoming a society that does it all, or tries to do it all.
Thanks for sharing that, Amanda, and kind of adding that additional perspective. So Cassidy, how have you been like handling it? So you mentioned like some of like the societal issues that are becoming more prevalent. Like what are some of these for you that you feel most passionate about or most strongly about, that you kind of carry with you most of the time?
Well, the town that I live in Montana is known to be a very liberal culture town. We are really strong and proud to be as accepting as we are in our community, which has allowed for a lot of protests to happen, which I love going down to, and I love being able to act in the community rather than just over social media, especially with the March for Our Montana Lives movement that happened during my freshman year of high school. 3/4 of our entire student body walked out that day, and my high school had 1,300 kids in it. And we stood along the largest bridge in our town and just lined the bridge with signs, and people drove over honking. And my high school actually decided they're just not going to give kids absence that day. If you walked out, you walked out. There was nothing they could do because 3/4 of the student body walked out, including teachers. So a lot of kids were just left in their classrooms, kids that didn't want to participate. But it was so moving to see such a large group of people standing up for the same thing. And that really just kind of sparked the fire in me that wants to change the world and stand up for what I believe in and participate in more movements like this, because change really does happen. Even in a small town in Montana, we can spark change at a local level, and by participating in that movement, we've sparked change at a national level. So really being able to just participate in things like that and stand up for the Black Lives Matter movement, even in Montana, has really just kind of helped me focus on what the good can be out of a pandemic, people coming together to realize the togetherness of what community can be. But yeah, that's really just kind of helped me focus really throughout this pandemic.
It really impresses me that y'all are so interested in that in high school. And again, I think back when I was in high school, and we talk about this being generational, but maybe it's also cultural, because growing up in more rural Texas, Texas is traditionally more conservative. And so I just can't even imagine our high school students doing something like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking again back to my own high school experience, and my first experience with protest wasn't related to a societal issue. It was like our principal was asked to leave or something like that, and they're working out some sort of deal, and the high school, all of us were on his side, and so like staged a sit-in to try to keep our principal essentially. And looking back now as I'm older, I'm sure there was a lot more behind the scenes that we didn't know about, but I think of like that being my first experience with protest was, oh, like we can like do a sit-in and refuse to go to class, and they're forced to kind of make a decision, right? Like, well, we can't punish all of you, but then like you're going to keep doing this unless we, you know, stand up for you, say that we're on your side, and keep our current principle. But thinking of like what that looks like to take that risk for something like March for Our Lives. And for our listeners who don't know, I believe March for Our Lives was basically a protest to speak out against school shootings and kind of asking for a little bit more government, I don't know, Cassidy, help me out here, like government assistance with that?
Yeah, so yeah, I can kind of talk about, so the March for Our Lives movement was kind of sparked after a lot of school shootings were happening in the winter of 2018, it would have been. And we actually ended up getting a couple threats and minor shootings at a local level at some of our local high schools, which really kind of sparked for everyone in our high schools and communities to want to create more legislation and speak out against gun control, because we don't feel safe sitting in our classrooms. And I know when I go to class and when I get put into a new classroom at the beginning of the school year, some of the first things I think of is, where is the closest exit? What am I going to do in this classroom if someone walks in here with a gun? Which it's horrible to think about, but in reality, in the reality of today, it's something that I have to think about. But yeah.
Do you think that that line of thinking like disrupts your ability to learn and be present in the classroom?
Oh, definitely, especially when there are students at my school that don't find it as worrisome as others do. Kids that think it's a joke, it's never going to happen in Montana. Why should I worry about it? And then they joke about it. We had a threat at our school last year that got some of us involved with having to talk to the sheriff, and we actually had to cancel school for a couple days. And I think that kind of woke up the community that we live in. It's like, this can actually happen. And if the people wouldn't have turned the kid in, there very likely could have been a shooting within the next couple days. This was at my high school last year. And if people don't take it seriously, then the school isn't going to take it seriously. And lockdowns, the drills are another thing that I've had to do since kindergarten. I've had to do multiple lockdown drills a year since kindergarten, which is something that I've just grown up with now. And it's something that's like, oh, okay, a lockdown, no biggie. We're just going to go sit in the closet with the lights off for 5 minutes. But the other people that, haven't grown up having to do lockdowns in their schools, it's absolutely mind boggling. But it's just kind of what the norm has become. And I wish it hasn't, just because I don't feel safe in school. And I know a lot of my peers don't feel safe at school, but there's not much that we can do, which is also, pretty worrisome.
Yeah, I'm curious, and maybe this question's for Courtney, for you too. Why have we gotten to this point where our kids in school are so worried about these things. I mean, and my gosh, I can't imagine parents having to worry about that as well, sending their kids to school with those worries.
Yeah, I know. I honestly wish I had an answer, because if I had an answer, I would definitely try to fix the problem. I think with our population growing, being the population growth being a really big factor in that, and the security of schools, I really think since 9/11 happened, there's been a lot of like a big security push in the United States, which has also caused a lot of people to uprise and be like, and disagree with what's happening. And I know a lot of schools now have the automatic locking on doors. And I really also think Columbine was really just a big spark, and not only inspired people to stand up against school shootings, but also people to realize and be like, oh, that's a good idea. And that's now why we've had 283 school shootings or so since Columbine.
Yeah, I was gonna say Columbine was the one that comes to mind for me when I think of what, like when we talk about like school security, that seemed to be the one that pushed it. Because it before then, I don't think it had really happened, and I'm okay being wrong on that. I'm not well versed in the history of school shootings, unfortunately. Even just when I was in high school, like our school security wasn't even close to what it was now. Like you could walk into the school no problem. Like you were supposed to go check in at the front office, right, and let people know that, oh, you're a visitor, and they give you a little name tag and like walk around the school. And I remember when I was in college coming back home and visiting some of my favorite teachers and like the band room and things like that. Like I just like showed up and they knew me because I had graduated just like the year before. But yeah, so I don't think I have an answer for that either, Amanda, and thinking about how we got here. But I know when I talk to young people about this and kind of hear your voices and your concerns with it, it blows my mind how we haven't done as much as I think that we can do. And not to start like a conversation over like what that looks like, but we're sending our kids into what might feel like a war zone. But to have to think about that in the classroom, have that be like an added distraction when you're just trying to learn and trying to get an education, I don't think that's fair to you. So I'm sorry that that is what we've left you with.
Right. Yeah. And it's honestly, as much as I'd like to say, oh, it's okay, it's not. Because I would love to obtain a normal education without having to worry about where the nearest exit is or which of my classmates is going to come into this classroom and kill me. It's absolutely gruesome that this is something that society has just accepted. Yeah, it's very scary, and it's something that I just kind of had to accept, and I have had to accept the fact that I will be in a school shooting someday, whether it's in high school or college or in my further education or my sister or a peer of mine. Like, someone is going to have to experience it just because of how common it is, and it's just kind of a waiting game as to when that will happen. So
Well, and we even worry about this in our churches now.
yep.
We're sending our leadership folks through active shooter training now for church and having security teams assembled, you know.
Yeah, that popped into my mind too, Amanda, of having these conversations at church. And I know, Cassie, you and I attend the same church here. And I'm curious, are you aware of those conversations happening through the church?
I guess I'm not necessarily aware that it's happening, but I do trust that it's happening at our church. I know that we have a much older congregation of people, and as much as I'd like to think a lot of them are very open minded about Generation Z and a lot of these conversations that are having to be sparked, I don't feel like a lot of them are. And I think it would be really beneficial to maybe have a sit down with a lot of the older members of our congregation and maybe our youth group to sit down and have these conversations, and maybe not necessarily a lot of the younger kids, but like a high school group, to just sit down and be able to communicate with them. This is what we're worried about, and for them to be like, okay, we see you, and we see them, and really just make even more connections within our church.
Do you feel like conversations like that happen in your church context often?
I would say no. And then, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but it's such a touchy subject. For one, it's you go to church, it's this, very beautiful, sanctioned place. And you wouldn't think you would go to church and talk about, school shootings and climate change and like all these world issues. You go there to pray and you go there for the sense of community that is created with God. And as much as I'd like to think that these conversations are happening within our congregation and throughout the entire conference, I don't feel like they have. I feel like definitely this can definitely be something that can be sparked within our conference, but at the same time, I don't really see it happening as much at the local level, and not even at our local church, but at other churches in Montana. That happening, I don't see it really being as prevalent as I would like it to be.
Yeah, I'm always curious what the church is doing to tackle topics like this and things like this. And how do you feel the church is handling stuff like this? I mean, outside of just administrative, like building security teams, things like that, but even just like all the societal topics and issues that you've mentioned before, how do you think the church is navigating these conversations, if at all?
Yeah, well, I'm honestly, just to start off, very grateful to have been raised in the Methodist Church, instead of a lot of the different churches that we have in Missoula, just because I've been raised in such a loving, accepting community where it's been raised within me that God loves me and He loves me no matter who I am, who I decide to love, what gender I want to be, no matter what. God will love me. I know that our church has definitely become a very accepting church. We have a rainbow flag hanging on the outside of our building, and we have a lot of, I know, groups within not only our church but other churches for people to go in and talk. And we have counseling meetings and we have AA meetings, and really just being able to reach out into the community and be like, hey, it's okay if you have this going on in your life, or hey, we accept you for who you are. Just that our church has been able to realize that is a huge deal. And especially the Mountain Sky Conference being such an accepting group of people, I definitely think has sparked change, not only in local Montana churches, but all over the Northwest, especially in the United Methodist Church as well.
I've always felt the local church hasn't always done a good job of including youth in leadership. And I don't know if you agree with that, but you rarely, you see strong youth groups and you see leaders within that youth group, but you don't see those leaders serving on committees within the church or things like that. And I think that's a problem. I think our local churches need more young voices in those areas as well.
I think about that too in terms of church leadership. And I don't know, Cassidy, what your experience is. Do you feel as though opportunities have been created for you to serve in youth leadership at your local church?
Within my local church, I don't necessarily see any places in which that I can be on a council or a leadership position. I know that if I got in contact with our pastor, he could probably point me in the direction of some things and boards and councils that I can maybe join. But the council for and like the board for our church camp, I know definitely is really passionate about having youth members on the board. And same with the Mountain Sky Youth Council. I'm just very excited to be a part of that, and learning what it is and being able to meet with like Amanda and other new kids that I've never met before from around the Northwest. But at a local level, I don't necessarily see any well published positions for youth to be on. And I know that there's kind of a stretch between like the youth group and the high school aged kids, just because we are a smaller church and our congregation isn't very large. But the lack of positions, I feel like, for youth is definitely prevalent. And I wish there were more, I would say, because I would probably get in on that. So.
And what's coming to mind for me right now is, and Amanda, you can speak to this too if you're aware of it, but I'm like pretty confident in our Book of Discipline, which is like our governing document for the United Methodist Church. I'm pretty sure our Book of Discipline like lists out ones that like you're not required to have a young person, but it's like written in the governing document that that like you should be able to have someone on this if there's a youth who's interested, and you should like actively be engaging them. But so I just think that's interesting that that's not something that's really put out there, which then makes me wonder too how often people on these committees are aware that young people should be serving in some of these roles.
Right. And I feel like y'all can disagree with me, but I'm going to call out the older generations here. I feel like a lot of folks are very outspoken with, oh, we need young voices, we need young people, we just love having the young people. Oh, but don't put them on our committees. You know, we're in charge of those committees. So I don't know.
Yep, I totally agree with you on that one. Especially when like the older generations are like, oh, you guys need to vote and we expect you to make these decisions in life, but then we speak out and we go to make those decisions and we go to vote, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, you shouldn't vote this way because like this and this and this, and like you're telling us to go out and do these things, and now you're telling us not to do these things because we don't agree with you. But yeah, I think there's massive disparity between generations, and just a loss of connection. And I think that can also be due to the increase in technology, especially. I know that some of my grandparents love using their phones. They'll call us, they'll FaceTime us. It's great. But my, other set will not touch a phone. You hang out in person, you don't do phone calls maybe once a month. I mean, even then, there's just such a disconnect between generations. And I wish there was a way that we could bridge that gap. But with everything happening in the world and there just being so much disagreement on, absolutely everything that people can disagree on, it's really hard to make those connections.
If we could work toward bridging that gap, what do you think that would look like to you?
Honestly, I think creating more opportunities for older generations to have to interact with younger generations is going to be a big thing for people to have to learn to see eye to eye on some issues, and also social media being such a big factor. People sharing stuff and it's like, oh, why did you share that? That's not okay. You can't be, posting things like that. And then all of a sudden you have another disconnect. And also just the disagreements. There's so many things for people to disagree on these days, and lots of things that people just refuse to see eye to eye on. Which, as much as I would love to say that I don't lose respect for some people that don't agree with me, it happens because it's a humanitarian issue that we are starting to face, and it's on moral issues that, if you're not gonna see eye to eye with me on some of these moral topics, then I can't see eye to eye with you. And as much as I would love to say, oh, politics aside, and okay, we don't have to agree on that, it's become an issue as to where people are refusing to see that other people are humans too. But if we're able to find just one thing that we're in common with, between generations, whether it's a sport we played or, oh yeah, you went to this college, I'm also going to go to this college, it can definitely allow for more connections to be made and the bridge to be closed a little bit.
Yeah, that was well put. Thank you.
Do you think that maybe older generations, and arguably like that includes millennials, the older generations kind of have like stereotypes against your generation, Gen Z, that might prevent some of those conversations from happening?
Oh, most definitely, especially the biggest one being just how outspoken we are. I have absolutely no problem going up and talking to an older person about the issues that are happening in my generation and like saying, hey, this is happening. by the way, and sharing posts on social media, and then getting targeted by older folks that are like, no, it's not, you're just a stupid teenager, this isn't happening, this isn't your place to be talking about it, and like, you can't make change, in your communities, you're just a teenager, you can't do it, whereas we can. And I think that it's hard for people to accept the fact that anyone can make change. We can look at Greta Thunberg, and she's making enormous changes in the climate change aspect of things, and people are just so focused on what they grew up with, and well, this is how I grew up and that's how you're going to grow up, that they're refusing to look at what is changing in the world, and maybe the things that are changing in the world are for the better, on a lot of different topics. But
How do you think God plays into this, or like faith and spirituality even?
as much as I would love to say, everyone has the same idea of God and everyone gets to experience the same experience that we get to have at our church camps and in our churches and at these retreats that we get to go to, I know that they don't. And I have a lot of peers who also go to church, and their idea of God is much different than mine. I've grown up to know that God's going to love me no matter what I do with my life. And it's living with Him within me that's going to allow me to create a better life, not only for me, but for my family and for my community, especially the church. And being able to create a progression along a lot of these topics and changes that are going to be happening, and not forcing ourselves to live a certain way and live under a certain way of God. And although that's something, the original idea of God was what a lot of people are still believing, what a lot of people grew up with, we can see that, more people are coming to realize, like, okay, maybe God does love lots of people, and isn't that what the purpose of God is to love His people? And yeah, I'm just, grateful for the Methodist Church for being as accepting as it is, and I honestly can't think of another type of church that is as accepting as we are, and I think it's honestly what we're known for. And I know that a lot of people have switched to our types of churches for that sole reason. So yeah.
Before we sign out, just kind of wanted to invite you to an opportunity to share either a scripture or a Bible story that you live by, if any. And if you don't have one, I don't know, what inspires you outside of that?
I guess not necessarily a Bible verse or scripture, but kind of just this phrase that we have up at our church camp. And it was this thing we did at my very first year of church camp, and we actually had to get in partners, and we had to say this back and forth to each other. And Courtney was actually my partner because I had gotten to camp late that year. But it's this phrase that goes, "You matter, you are worthy, you are beautiful, you are loved." And I probably think of that phrase once a day, easy. And I love telling that to people when they're in a time of disparity and when they're really down on themselves. Just being like, hey, this is okay. Whatever's happening is okay. You matter. You have worthiness in the world. And you are so, so, so beautiful. And you are loved no matter what.
We all needed to hear that, I think.
Thanks again for being here, Cass. I hope you know your voice matters. You have worth in this world. You're beautiful, and you are a beloved child of God, and we appreciate all of your wisdom and for being with us today. And I've really enjoyed getting to talk to you. I'm sure Amanda has as well, not to speak for her.
You used the word wisdom, and I think that there was no more appropriate word. Thank you for your wisdom, Khasidy.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Mountain Sky Prophets. Mountain Sky Prophets is brought to you by Young People's Ministries and Next Gen and Inclusiveness Ministries of the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church. You can find us at www.mtnskyumc.org. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure you tell your friends to listen in too.